Welcome to The Learning Landscape, a podcast dedicated to inspiring and equipping educators across the magnificent island of Tasmania. I'm Simon Matthews, and in this episode we're bringing you hope and practical tips and the latest insights to making your teaching journey even more rewarding. This episode is proudly brought to you by Independent Schools Tasmania. Well, today I've got the privilege of speaking with Vince Ford, an author, an international speaker and storyteller, and he's coming to us all the way from New Zealand. So Vince, welcome to The Learning Landscape.
Thanks, Simon. Good to be here.
Vince, as I said, you're an international speaker and you spend a lot of your life talking about storytelling. Help us understand what you know about that and your experience of why storytelling is such an important tool for school leaders.
Well, storytelling is about social connecting. It's how we form community. It's something we've done for hundreds of thousands of years, and I reckon our brains developed alongside storytelling. It's a skill that I think's been watered down, it's been lost. We choose in our private lives, we watch a movie on the weekends, we go to theatre, we watch a game of sports, and often that's the stories involved in those sports that are the bits that capture us. And if it's so effective, if it's something we choose to do, well, why would we ignore that in a leadership environment, in a school? I think there's a huge opportunity to utilise it there.
I know that you've previously talked with me about how you use storytelling to identify and amplify a desired culture in a school. It was a fascinating story, and I'm wondering if you can tell that story again for our listeners today.
Yeah, there's a school just down the road from me at Mokoroa Point School in New Zealand, and they used to be the best little school in the bay. But Mokoroa is a little peninsula and it's rapidly developing. There's new housing going in. It's no longer a little school. And Sandra, the principal, was wondering about rebranding their school or thinking about where they're going in the future. And she did a real strategic plan, thinking about what's their direction, where they're going, and was looking to tie that in with something that really reflected who they were. And she called me in. My wife actually works in educational leadership, and she said, hey, I know someone that might be able to help you out. I've written 17 kids novels, so my background's in writing. So I came down there and worked with the school, and the one thing that really stood out from interviewing the community and the kids was belonging. Kids were coming from elsewhere. They didn't grow up there, so belonging to something, to a community, was hugely important. And the other part, and often it's really useful to tie in the physical landscape, the place itself. And in Mokoroa, the kuaka, the Bātau godwit, live throughout the summer, and they fly all the way down from Siberia, the longest migration of any bird in the world. They fly through 8 days and nights right across a massive ocean. It's an incredible journey. So we tied that in. Sandra used to see them going over the school and said, well, how can we tie this in? So I ended up working with the kids, doing some workshops, and we put a story together, a kid's book, about a little kuaka that flew all the way through 8 days and nights, and it lands down on the spit at Tino Paibaiaro, Mokoroa, and it's welcomed by an elder and says, welcome, you're home. And she says, well, how is this home? This is nothing like I've seen before. What makes this home? And the kuaka says, well, you're like us. You're a navigator, you're a citizen, you're a learner. And those are the 3 attributes that they push in their graduate profile. And we learn together, we fly together. And we tell a little bit more of a story about how the kuaka learns that she is like the others, and she flies back and realises as she swoops down onto the Tino Paibaiaro that she is like the others there, that this is home. And that story we put together in a book, and a local real estate agent was happy to sponsor it, so they could put the book down in their open homes that they had. Any families that come in, the kids could look through the book, and it told them about the school. But every family receives that book before the kids start the school, and it tells that story. Their uniforms, their signage, their houses are all items or places that are mentioned within that story. So it goes right through their education. It's become central to more than just the school. It's become a real community treasure.
I love that. I mean, you talk about moving from strategy to story, and it just becomes so embedded, so that everything in that school is about that story. And even before I come into the school, I know that story and I know where I fit. That's lovely.
Yeah, and interesting, Sandra was talking to some mentors who work in the business world, the Springboard Trust it's called, and they have partnerships between business and school leaders. And they were looking at her school strategy, and the strategic plan was essentially what was unpacked in the book and what she'd done in that project, building the graduate profile right throughout the school, so that it was where they were going. It was leaving a real imprint in the school.
Part of the challenge of that story, I think, is that you tell it so well, and it's such a powerful story that it's easy for school leaders to go, oh yeah, look, that's that school and that story, but my school doesn't have a story. If we do believe that every organisation, every school does have a story, how can school leaders become more intentional about shaping that story that their culture tells?
Well, you'll probably, like myself, you probably walk into a lot of schools, and I used to go in with Writers in Schools program, and within 5 minutes, you've got a pretty good idea of where that school is at, by how you're greeted, by what's on the walls, by what the people say and how they interact with each other. And that can just happen, and you get good people when you get lucky, and you get a great experience. But if you're really intentional about that and you want to say, well, what are we about? What do we stand for? How do we want to greet people coming into the school? How do we want them to feel? Then that becomes, if you can really articulate that and say what those values are that you hold, and build that right through the staff and the students and the whole community, then you can create something. You're not accidentally building a place that people want to come to or don't want to come to. You're structuring it around something that matters to the whole community. And that's how a school really becomes part of a community, and it's central to that.
One of the things that I've heard you talk about before is this idea about leading with influence rather than just making something a compliant task. Okay, the boss wants us to do this. So when you actually do move from leading with some level of authority toward compliance or leading with influence toward a change in culture, what are you actually seeing move? What are you seeing shift in that school that's actually about the influence?
Well, I wonder firstly whether enforcing compliance is leadership at all. I think there's an element of management, and that comes through the way we set up schools. The fact that we've got 30 kids in a classroom, then we've got to manage them, and it's kind of nuts when you think about it that way. And schools are beginning to, some of the schools are looking at that in a different way. I've learnt a little bit about alpha schools recently and the way they're using AI to put the subject matter they want to learn, because it's a knowledge-driven curriculum in their situation, within a couple of hours, and really highlighting that. And you get through that in a couple of hours, then we're having some real student-led projects. And it's about tapping into the students' interests and their desires and capturing their attention so they want to come to school. They want to learn. And if you're really building up that side of it, encouraging them and supporting them, and sure, you have to have some regulation, some control. But when you're pushing it from a desire side, if you're driving with the carrot rather than the stick, that's leadership. That's not management.
Yeah, I love it. If people look for you online, some of what they'll see is that you're known for moving audiences sort of from laughter right through to tears. So people talk about the way that you can actually move those listeners that you're working with. How important do you think emotional connection is in building this sort of culture in schools? It can be a bit of a thing that people run from. I don't want to be an emotional leader. I don't want to have an emotional school. But what's this sense of emotion and its connection with other people that's so important in building a strong organisation, strong school culture?
And emotion's absolutely underrated when it comes to performance and leadership. If you look at the work of Antonio Damasio, I was lucky enough, I spoke at the Australian Heads of Independent Schools conference last year. I was the closing speaker and had breakfast with Mary Helen Imaldino Yang. She worked under Antonio Damasio. But the impact that emotion has on moving people towards action. You can give all the stats and all the data in the world, but if you're not telling a story with that stats and data, if you're not engaging people in a way that moves them, it's just so much noise. Humans are absolutely emotional creatures driven by emotion, and you look at the work of Antonio Damasio in business, that's proven. It's not just an idea, and we can get information from data, but then when we transfer and tell stories with that data, if people interact with it in a way that moves them, and if you're able to tell that story, then you can support the data and you can actually move towards action rather than letting stuff just happen to you.
I can imagine that there are going to be leaders and teachers listening today thinking, you know what, I'd love to be a better storyteller. I'd love to have that as part of my toolkit. Help us understand what's one simple first step that people, educators, can take to start using story more intentionally in their school, in their classroom.
No, that's right in my wheelhouse. I actually run leadership. I did some work with middle leaders actually at the Knox School over in Melbourne earlier this year. I run workshops with senior leaders or middle leadership or whole schools, in fact. But the big thing about storytelling is it's about identifying a moment of change. So you think about what needs to happen, what needs to change, whether it's one word, maybe it's empathy, or maybe it's diligence, or maybe it's resilience. And you think about that one word and then you just take it back to yourself and say, well, when did you really learn about resilience? And every one of us has got a story of that, where we got it wrong, when we weren't resilient and we suffered because of that. If it was respect, it'll be when we were 10 years old and we disrespected someone and we found out really smartly that that's not what you do. But you lead with that story and it says, hey, I've been there too. So even if you've got to discipline a staff member or you've got to talk to a staff member about that, you lead with that story and they're not immediately on the defensive. You're saying, hey, we make mistakes. I've made that mistake too. But then let's talk about that, and this is what I've learned from that. Maybe we need to look at that for you, and how can we move past this? It's a way to introduce that's fairly threatening, but it also brings people on side, and it's a simple thing to do.
You work with a lot of people and a lot of schools throughout your year. What as you go to start to work with those teams or those schools, what's one hope that you have for them? What's a big hope that actually drives you in your work with schools?
Probably the other side to storytelling is the listening side of that story. And they're two sides of the same coin. But you listen for those moments of change. You listen for the emotion that might be in someone's voice. And sometimes it means just stopping and saying, hey, tell me about that. What's actually going on with you? In leadership, I talk all about storytelling, but there's always two sides to that. And actually being able to stop, give the time, and it's a huge gift that often we're really short of. But give the time, listen, and then move on from there with a broader understanding of what you're talking about.
Vince, you've helped us have a really human response, a human understanding of leadership, and we really thank you for that. Thanks for making time for us today. Vince, if people want to connect with you further, with you and your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just look up my website, vinceford.org, so it's just my name, .org. There's email, there's phone number on there, and contact me on LinkedIn. If you just want to connect and see what I'm up to, I'm more than happy to connect, see what you're up to too. And if there's possibilities to work together, then that'll be a great opportunity. I'd love to come to Tassie.
Great. Well, we'd love to have you at some point. Vince, thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time and your experience.
Much appreciated. Awesome.
And thank you for tuning into this episode of The Learning Landscape. We hope that you found some new insights and maybe even some ideas to apply in your own educational journey. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, why don't you like us or leave a review? It really helps other educators find our podcast. Until next time, keep exploring the landscape of learning.